Anya was 80 years old when the notice was nailed to her door. The paper was crisp, the ink black against the weathered pine. It gave her 7 days. After 24 years in the small cabin, renting month to month, the land had been sold. The new owner, a man from the east named Sterling, planned to raise sheep. A cabin occupied by an old woman and her dog was not part of that plan. She had $112 saved. It was not enough to buy passage anywhere. It was not enough to buy land. It was barely enough to buy provisions for a winter she no longer had a roof for. Her dog, Finn, a golden retriever with fur the color of dried prairie grass, rested his head on her knee. His presence was a solid, warm weight against the sudden emptiness of her future. She read the notice again. The words did not change. 7 days. It was August. The air was thick with the drone of insects and the smell of sun-baked dust. The nights were cooling, a subtle promise of the hardship to come. Most would have despaired. Most would have pleaded. Anya simply folded the paper, tucked it into the pocket of her apron, and went back to her work shelling beans. Her hands, gnarled by decades of labor, moved with a steady, unbroken rhythm. Her husband Eric had been gone for 15 years. He had been a builder, a man who understood stone and soil, wind and snow. He did not trust structures that sat on the land, he trusted structures that were part of it. The earth gives shelter, he used to say, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. You just have to know how to ask. He had taught her everything. How to read the seams in a hillside, how to tell clay from loam by its feel, how to see the way water wanted to run. Knowledge others had forgotten or never possessed. As she worked, a memory surfaced. Eric, pointing to a low rise of hills 2 miles north of the town. That's good earth, he'd said. Yellow clay under 3 feet of topsoil. Holds its shape. Stays dry. It was a piece of information with no use at the time. Now, it was the only thing she owned of any value. The plan did not form in a flash of inspiration. It accreted, one small, hard fact at a time. She had a shovel. She had a pickaxe. She had a wheelbarrow with one wobbly wheel. And she had the knowledge Eric had left her. She would not beg for a place in the town's poorhouse. She would not be a burden. She would build. Not on the land, but in it. It was a decision that would be dismissed as madness, the last desperate act of a forgotten woman. It would, in time, prove to be the most sophisticated piece of engineering the territory had ever seen. The first day was for observation. Anya walked the 2 miles to the rise of hills, Finn trotting quietly beside her. She carried nothing but a small hand spade and a water skin. The sun was relentless. She ignored the town to her south, a collection of false fronts and dusty streets. Her focus was the land itself. The hills were unremarkable, covered in sparse grass and dotted with hardy shrubs. She was looking for a specific slope, one facing south, to catch the low winter sun. One with good drainage, where water would shed away from the base, not pool against it. She found it around noon. A gentle slope, perhaps 15 degrees, with a clear view of the plains. She knelt, plunging the spade into the earth. The first foot was dark, rich topsoil. She set it aside carefully. This would be needed later, for the roof. She dug deeper. At 2 feet, the soil became lighter, firmer. At 3 feet, her spade hit it. A dense, sticky, yellow clay. Eric had been right. She worked a piece of it in her hands. It was perfect. Malleable but strong. It held its shape. It would not crumble. This would be the place. The next 6 days, before the eviction deadline, were a blur of managed labor. Each morning before sunrise, she loaded the wobbly wheelbarrow with her tools, the shovel, the pickaxe, a bucket, and her husband's old framing hammer. She and Finn made the 2-mile trek. She worked for 4 hours, until the sun became too high and too hot. Then she would rest in the shade of a lone cottonwood, sharing her water and a piece of hardtack with the dog, before walking back to the cabin to pack. She packed not clothes or keepsakes, but necessities. A small cast iron stove. A box of dried beans. A sack of flour. Cured meats. Salt. Her husband's tools. She made a dozen trips with the wheelbarrow, hiding her cache of supplies under a canvas top near the building site. The town barely noticed. They saw an old woman pushing a wheelbarrow. They assumed she was scavenging or losing her mind. No one asked. No one offered to help. On the 7th day, she scrubbed the cabin floor, left the key on the simple pine table, and walked away without looking back. She and Finn did not stop at the town. They walked north, towards the hill. The real work was about to begin. Digging. Day after day. The rhythm of it entered her bones. Pickaxe to break the earth. Shovel to lift it. Wheelbarrow to move it. She was not carving a simple hole. She was engineering a space. The entrance was narrow, just 3 feet wide, angled to break the prevailing northwest wind. After 5 feet, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. 10 feet wide, 14 feet long. The ceiling was arched, a shape she knew would bear weight better than any flat roof. Each swing of the pickaxe was precise. Each shovelful of earth was deliberate. She piled the excavated clay and soil nearby, forming a long, low berm that further shielded the entrance. The physical cost was immense. Her back ached constantly. Her hands blistered, split open, then calloused over. She was 80 years old. The work should have been impossible. But she ate. She rested. And she worked with an efficiency born of a lifetime of labor. She did not waste a single motion. 3 feet down. 4 feet. 5. The air in the dugout grew cooler. A welcome respite from the late summer heat. The clay walls were smooth and cool to the touch. Finn would lie just inside the entrance, watching her, a silent, dusty guardian. By the end of the 2nd week, the main chamber was hollowed out. A space 10 by 14 feet with a 7-foot arched ceiling. It was a cave. A tomb, some might call it. But Anya saw the potential. She saw the shape of home. She had asked the earth for shelter. And slowly, painfully, it was beginning to answer. The raw space was only the beginning. A hole in the ground is a grave. A home requires structure, warmth, and air. Anya's next task was to prevent the earth from reclaiming what she had taken. She needed internal supports. She had no money for milled lumber. So she scavenged. The new railroad had left behind a trove of discarded materials, split ties, broken lengths of pine, heavy oak planks deemed unsuitable for the track. For a week, she and Finn walked the rail line, collecting what she could haul in her wheelbarrow. Each piece was chosen for a purpose. The thickest oak planks were for the entrance, forming a heavy lintel and door frame sunk deep into the clay. The pine boards, she split into shims and braces for the arched ceiling, tapping them into place, creating a framework of support that distributed the immense weight of the earth above. It was slow, patient work. Fitting, measuring, cutting with a dull handsaw. She worked by the light of a single lantern, the small flame casting long shadows against the curving clay walls. Water was the next enemy. A dugout could become a cistern in the first heavy rain. Eric had taught her the solution was not to fight the water, but to guide it. Before adding the roof, she dug a shallow trench, a French drain, around the entire perimeter of the dugout's footprint, about a foot deep and filled with small rocks she gathered from a nearby creek bed. This would intercept water seeping down through the topsoil and channel it away from her walls. For the roof, she laid long timbers across the opening, resting them on the solid, undisturbed earth on either side. Over the timbers, she laid thick canvas tarps she'd scavenged, pulling them taut and securing them with rocks. Then came the most important part. She carefully replaced the topsoil she had first excavated, spreading it a foot deep over the entire roof structure. Finally, she transplanted plugs of prairie grass onto the soil. Within a few weeks, the grass would take root. The dugout would look less like a structure and more like a natural swell in the land. From a distance, it would be invisible. Only the small, dark opening of the door and a single, curious pipe sticking out of the ground would betray its existence. This pipe was for air. Another of Eric's principles. A home must breathe. She installed 2 vents. One low in the wall near the door for intake, a 4-inch pipe that ran 50 feet away to draw in fresh, untainted air. The second was the chimney for the stove, which would exhaust smoke and stale air. The system relied on the simple physics of convection. Hot air rises. The stove would draw fresh, cold air in through the low vent, and expel hot exhaust through the chimney, creating constant, silent air circulation. It was a lung for her small, subterranean home. By late September, the structure was complete. It was rough. It was built from scraps. But it was solid. It was dry. And it was hers. The days were growing shorter. The nights held a sharp, crystalline chill. The town was preparing for winter in the usual way, stacking cords of firewood, sealing windows, banking foundations with straw. They were reinforcing their homes against the cold. Anya was doing something different. She was building a home that worked with it. The heart of the dugout was not its walls or its roof. It was the system for heat. A conventional fireplace or stove is a paradox. It warms you while it steals the very air you need to breathe, and sends most of its heat straight up a chimney. It is a hungry, inefficient machine. Eric had called it burning wood to heat the sky. He had learned a different way in the old country, a method born from brutal winters and scarce fuel. Anya set about recreating it from memory. First, she did not place her small cast-iron stove in the center of the room. She built a platform of flat stones and clay mortar against the far wall. The stove would sit on this platform, but it would not be the primary source of radiant heat. It was merely the engine. The true innovation was what lay beneath the floor. Before laying the floorboards, she had dug a series of shallow, interconnected trenches in the hard-packed clay. The trenches were about a foot wide and a foot deep, laid out in a serpentine pattern that covered the entire floor area. Starting from the base of the stove platform, the main channel snaked back and forth across the length of the room before connecting to the chimney flue at the opposite wall. She lined these trenches with thin, flat stones, and then capped them with larger, carefully fitted flagstones, sealing the joints with wet clay. This was the hypercaust. The plenum. The heat exchanger. When she installed the stove, she did not vent it directly upwards. Instead, the stovepipe was directed downwards, into the opening of this subfloor channel. The hot smoke and exhaust gases from the fire would be forced to travel through the entire 60-foot length of the serpentine flue before they could escape through the chimney. As the superheated gases moved through the sealed stone channels, they would transfer their thermal energy directly into the stone and clay mass of the floor. The floor itself would become the radiator. It was a massive thermal battery. It would take longer to heat up, but once warm, it would hold that heat for hours, even after the fire in the stove had died down. Next, she built her bed. It was not a piece of furniture. It was a low, raised platform of solid earth and clay, built against the wall next to the stove. A secondary branch of the hot flue was routed directly through the core of this platform. Her sleeping surface would be gently, constantly warmed from within. The floorboards, salvaged pine, were laid last, resting on small stone piers that left an air gap above the flagstone caps of the flue. The wood would never get hot enough to burn, only warm to the touch. A slow, gentle, pervasive warmth. The system was complete. It cost nothing. It required no extra fuel. It was silent. And it was designed to turn the greatest liability of a fire, waste heat, into the dugout's greatest asset. She tested it on the first truly cold night in October. She lit a small fire in the stove, using just a few pieces of scrap wood. For the first hour, nothing seemed to happen. The air in the dugout remained cold. But then, slowly, a change began. A subtle warmth began to rise from the floorboards. The clay of her sleeping platform grew tepid, then warm. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, the entire space was filled with a comfortable, even heat. There were no cold spots. No drafts. The temperature inside was 65 degrees. Outside, it was 28. She laid a hand on the wooden floor. It was warm. She ran her hand along the wall of her earthen bed. It was warmer still. Finn, who usually curled into a tight ball on cold nights, was stretched out on his side on the floor, deeply asleep. The earth was holding the heat. Eric's knowledge was alive, working in the stone and clay beneath her feet. Mr. Sterling, the landlord, discovered her by accident. He was out surveying his new property lines in early November when he saw a thin wisp of smoke rising, seemingly from the ground itself. Curiosity and a sense of proprietorship led him to investigate. He found the low, grass-covered mound, the cleverly hidden door, and Anya, sitting on a small stool just outside, mending a tear in a grain sack. Finn gave a low growl, and Anya looked up. She showed no surprise. No fear. Sterling was a man accustomed to deference. He was not unkind, but he operated from a position of innate authority. He saw a hole in the ground, not a home. "What is this?" he asked. His tone was not accusatory, just baffled. "You can't be living here." "This is a root cellar." Anya threaded her needle. "It is my home." A few days later, he returned, this time with Reverend Michael from the town church. The Reverend was a good man, earnest and well-meaning, but his thinking ran along established channels of charity and social order. He saw a parishioner in a state of degradation. They stood at the entrance, two tall, dark figures silhouetted against the grey sky, peering into the gloom of the dugout. "Anya," the Reverend began, his voice laced with practiced pity. "This is no way for a person to live. It's a burrow. It's not safe. The town has a room for you at the boarding house. A clean bed. Hot meals." Anya did not invite them in. She stood at the threshold, a small, unmovable presence. "I have a clean bed," she said. Her voice was even, without defiance. It was a statement of fact. "And my meals are hot." Mr. Sterling gestured at the low ceiling, the earthen walls. "This place will be damp and freezing in a month. You'll catch your death in here." "It's a tomb." "The floor is warm," Anya stated. Mr. Sterling and the Reverend exchanged a look. The look was a mixture of pity and condescension. An old woman, her mind clearly going. A warm floor. It was nonsense. Sterling said, softening his voice as one would to a child. "I understand you're resourceful. But this is no substitute for a proper house with a proper hearth. We can't, in good conscience, allow you to stay here through the winter. It would be a moral failing on our part." He believed what he was saying. He felt a genuine, if paternalistic, responsibility for her welfare. He could not comprehend the principles at work in the small, dark space before him. He saw only what it lacked: windows, height, milled lumber, social approval. He could not see what it possessed: thermal mass, convective efficiency, a symbiotic relationship with the surrounding earth. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend Mr. Sterling," Anya said. The words were polite, but the tone was final. "I am well. I will not be a burden to the town." She did not argue. She did not explain the serpentine flue beneath her feet or the physics of a thermal battery. To do so would have been pointless. Their framework for understanding the world had no category for what she had built. They saw a primitive shelter. She knew it was a machine for living. They left, shaking their heads, resolving to return with the sheriff after the first snow to forcibly remove her for her own good. Anya watched them go. Then she went inside, closing the heavy oak door, and returned to her life. The isolation was now complete. She was no longer just poor and forgotten, she was now officially eccentric, a mad woman living in a hole. The final preparations were small, meticulous tasks. Anya's system was built on efficiency, and this extended to her fuel supply. While the townspeople stacked massive cords of oak and hickory, believing volume was security, Anya gathered fuel with a different philosophy. She needed very little. Her stove was small, her dugout insulated by 1,000,000 tons of earth. the heat, once generated, was not wasted up a chimney but stored in the floor. She spent her days collecting not logs, but branches, fallen limbs, even dried brush. She needed only what could be burned quickly and hot to charge the thermal mass of her floor. Her woodpile was a mockery of a real winter supply. It was a small, neat stack, no bigger than a piece of furniture. It would not have lasted a week in a conventional cabin. For her, it was enough for a month. Inside, she organized her provisions. Her world had shrunk to the 10 by 14-foot room, and every object had its place. Jars of dried beans, sacks of flour and cornmeal, and slabs of cured bacon were stored in a small alcove dug into the coolest part of the clay wall, a natural pantry. Her few utensils hung from wooden pegs. Her bed was a simple straw-filled mattress on the heated clay platform, covered with 2 wool blankets. It was a spare, functional existence. There was no decoration. There was no sentiment. Everything was a tool for survival. Her only companion was Finn. The dog had adapted to the subterranean life with ease. He spent his days sleeping on the warm floorboards or sitting near the open door, watching the prairie. His presence was a quiet comfort, a living warmth that had nothing to do with physics. As December approached, the weather grew colder. The prairie grass turned a pale, brittle tan. The sky took on a hard, metallic sheen. In town, Mr. Sterling was settling into his new home, a handsome 2-story frame house built with the best lumber and insulated with horsehair plaster. It had a large fieldstone fireplace in the main room and a modern iron stove in the kitchen. He had laid in 4 cords of wood and felt secure. The Reverend Michael preached sermons on preparing for the spiritual winter, while his parishioners prepared for the literal one, their homes banked with straw, their windows sealed. They looked at the coming cold as an enemy to be fought, a siege to be endured. They trusted their thick walls, their big fires, their stockpiles. Their systems were designed to fight the environment, to hold it at bay with brute force and constant consumption of fuel. Anya's system was designed to cooperate with it. She was not fighting the cold. She was using the earth to temper it. Her insulation was the hill itself. Her heat source was small, but its effect was multiplied by intelligent design. She required so little because she wasted nothing. On the evening of December 21st, the winter solstice, a strange stillness fell. The air grew heavy. The temperature, which had been hovering in the low 20s, began to plummet. Anya stepped outside and looked at the sky. A low, bruised-looking bank of clouds was massing on the northwestern horizon. There was no wind. Not yet. She had seen skies like this before. She called Finn inside, closed the heavy door, and bolted it from within. She added 3 small pieces of wood to the stove, then closed the damper to a narrow slit. She did not need a roaring fire. She only needed to keep the coals alive, to keep feeding a slow, steady trickle of heat into the stone and clay beneath her. Outside, the world was holding its breath. Inside, the floor was 15 degrees warmer than the air. The dugout was ready. The blizzard did not arrive. It materialized. One moment, there was a tense calm, the next, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and driving snow. The wind came first, a low moan that rose to a piercing shriek. It struck the north side of the hill with the force of a physical blow. Any structure exposed to that wind was being tested. Trees groaned. Buildings shuddered. In town, the first casualty was loose shingles, then shutters torn from their hinges. The temperature fell with astonishing speed. From 20 degrees Fahrenheit to 10. Then to 0. Then to -15. The numbers were no longer an abstraction. They were a measure of survival. Snow followed the wind. It was not a gentle flurry. It was a horizontal wall of white, fine and sharp as sand, erasing the horizon, the sky, the ground itself. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. To be caught outside was a death sentence. Inside the dugout, there was almost no sound. The millions of tons of earth absorbed the roar of the wind, reducing it to a faint, distant hum. There was no rattle of windows, no shuddering of walls. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the embers in the stove and the rhythmic breathing of the dog asleep on the floor. Anya sat on a small stool, calmly grinding corn into meal for the next day's bread. The air temperature inside the dugout was a steady 68 degrees. The floor was a constant, gentle warmth beneath her feet. Her single lantern cast a pool of amber light. It was an island of perfect calm in the heart of the storm. The air remained fresh. The convective loop, the dugout's lung, was working perfectly. The stove's draft pulled fresh, oxygenated air in through the long intake pipe, whose opening was now buried under 3 feet of snow. The pipe, however, remained clear, drawing air from the porous layers of the snowpack itself. The system was breathing under a blanket of white. It was a detail Eric had insisted upon. The intake must be long, and its opening protected from direct impact. A small detail that now meant the difference between clean air and suffocation. For 2 days, the storm raged without pause. The snow piled up. 4 feet. 5 feet. 6. It buried fences, then sheds, then the first floors of smaller cabins. The town was paralyzed, each family isolated in its own small box, fighting its own private war against the cold. The battle was measured in fuel. In every home, stoves and fireplaces were burning at their maximum rate, devouring wood just to keep the indoor temperature above freezing. But the harder the fires burned, the more cold air they sucked in through the cracks in the walls and floors, creating vicious drafts. The heat they generated rose immediately to the ceiling, leaving the floors frigid. They were heating the top 2 feet of their rooms while their feet went numb. It was a battle of attrition, and they were losing. The blizzard was not just an assault of cold, it was an assault on their systems, and those systems were proving to be fundamentally flawed. They were powerful, but wasteful. They were big, but inefficient. And in the face of an overwhelming force, their brute force approach was beginning to fail. In his handsome, well-built house, Mr. Sterling was discovering the limits of conventional wisdom. On the first night of the storm, he had felt secure. He kept the large stone fireplace roaring, a cheerful blaze that symbolized warmth and prosperity. But the fire was a glutton. It consumed logs at an alarming rate. And the chimney, for all its solid construction, was proving to be a problem. The wind, howling over the peak of his roof, created a downdraft, periodically puffing smoke back into the room. The house was filled with a hazy, acrid smell. By the morning of the second day, a more serious issue emerged. The immense amount of snow had drifted against the north and west sides of the house, burying his windows and piling up against the walls. The house was no longer shedding snow, it was being encased by it. The temperature inside, despite the ravenous fire, had dropped to 40 degrees. The floors were ice cold. He and his wife were bundled in every blanket they owned, huddled near the hearth, but the radiant heat barely reached them. The rest of the house was a frozen landscape. The real crisis began that afternoon. His woodpile, which had seemed so immense, was on the far side of the yard, now buried under 7 feet of impacted snow. He had only a day's supply left on the porch. He attempted to venture out to get more, but the wind and the depth of the snow drove him back, his lungs burning from the -20-degree air. He was trapped. His fortress had become his prison. The large windows, once a mark of luxury, were now massive surfaces of heat loss. The high ceilings, a sign of status, were useless reservoirs of warmth he couldn't access. Every feature that made the house impressive in good weather made it a liability in this. He thought of the old woman. Anya. He had dismissed her dwelling as a primitive burrow. A grave. He had pitied her. Now, a terrifying thought began to form in his mind. Her shelter had no windows. It had no high ceilings. It was buried. But it was not buried by accident. It was buried by design. The snow that was suffocating his house was merely adding another layer of insulation to hers. The wind that was tearing at his roof could not touch her. He had tried to fight the winter. She had joined it. The realization was a cold shock, more chilling than the air in his home. His entire understanding of shelter, of security, of what constituted a proper home, was collapsing around him. He had built with money and pride. She had built with knowledge. And in the crucible of the storm, knowledge was proving to be the only thing that mattered. By nightfall on the second day, the last of his wood was gone. The fire in the hearth died, and the temperature in the house began to plummet. It was no longer a matter of comfort. It was a matter of survival. Desperation is a powerful motivator. As the last embers died in his fireplace, and the temperature in his fine house plunged past freezing, Mr. Sterling made a decision. He would not die in his cold, dark, expensive home. He thought of Anya's dugout. He remembered the wisp of smoke rising from the ground. It seemed an impossible, insane hope, but it was the only one he had. He bundled himself in every layer of wool he possessed, pulled a heavy coat over it all, and told his wife he was going for help. He was going to the old woman in the hill. The journey was less than half a mile, but it was a trek through an Arctic hell. The moment he stepped outside, the wind tore the breath from his lungs. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, heavy powder that made each step a monumental effort. He had no landmarks. The world was an undulating sea of white, the air a blinding vortex of ice crystals. He navigated by pure instinct, keeping the shrieking wind at his back, knowing the hills lay to the north. He fell a dozen times. He lost all feeling in his feet, then his hands. His face was a frozen mask. The cold was a living thing, a predator seeking to drain the last of his warmth. He was a man of property, of standing. Now he was just a small, freezing creature, humbled by the absolute power of the storm. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled into the base of the hills. He was disoriented, on the verge of collapse. He almost missed it. A faint, circular depression in the snow, and a darker shape within it. The door. He clawed his way through the drift, his frozen hands fumbling at the wood. He pounded on it, his blows muffled by the snow and the wind. He shouted her name, his voice a raw, desperate croak that the wind snatched away. He was not sure if anyone could hear. He was about to give up, to lie down and let the cold take him, when he heard the sound of a bolt being drawn. The heavy door swung inward. A rectangle of warm, yellow light appeared in the white chaos. Anya stood there, holding a lantern. She was not wearing a coat. She was in a simple wool dress. Behind her, Finn stood, watching him, not growling. She looked at the half-frozen man caked in snow, his face a mask of ice and desperation. She showed no surprise. No triumph. She simply stepped back. "Come in," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried over the storm. Sterling stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor, bringing a swirl of snow and frigid air with him. The door closed, and the roar of the blizzard was instantly silenced. The first thing he noticed was the quiet. The second was the warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a fireplace. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to rise from the very floor beneath him. He pulled off his gloves with numb fingers and placed his hands on the wooden floorboards. They were warm. He stared, uncomprehending. The air was fresh and sweet, with the smell of baking bread. He saw the small stove, but it held only a bed of glowing embers. It could not possibly be generating this much heat. Anya handed him a tin cup of hot, sweet tea. He drank it, the warmth spreading through his chest. He looked around the small, curved room. He saw the neat stack of provisions, the tools on the wall, the sleeping platform. He saw a system, complete and perfect. A machine for living that was purring along, effortlessly, in the heart of the worst storm in a decade. "The floors," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "How is the floor warm?" Anya looked at him. She did not mock his ignorance. She did not remind him that he had called her home a tomb. "The heat does not go up the chimney," she said, as if explaining the simplest thing in the world. "It goes under the floor first." In that moment, Sterling understood. He saw the elegant, undeniable logic of it. He saw his own arrogance, his own foolishness, laid bare. He, the man of progress and property, had been saved by the ancient, forgotten knowledge of a woman he had tried to evict. He had come seeking shelter. He had found humility. The blizzard broke on the fourth day. The wind died down, and the sun emerged, brilliant and blinding on the new, white world. The landscape was transformed, sculpted into massive drifts and deep valleys of snow. In town, people began to emerge, digging themselves out, assessing the damage. The toll was significant. Several outlying barns had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Livestock had been lost. 2 prospectors, caught in the open, were found frozen in their wagon. Every house had a story of burst pipes, of dwindling fuel, of a desperate, losing battle against the cold. Mr. Sterling returned to his home to find his wife safe, but the house was a wreck. The interior temperature was below zero. Cans of food in the pantry had frozen and split open. A fine layer of snow covered every surface, blown in through countless small cracks he never knew existed. The house he had been so proud of had failed its first true test. That afternoon, a group of men from the town, led by the Reverend Michael, made their way to Anya's dugout. They were a rescue party. They carried shovels and blankets, expecting to find her frozen or suffocated. They had come to save the mad old woman from her folly. They spent an hour digging through the massive drift that covered her door. When they finally broke through, they were met with the same sight that had greeted Mr. Sterling. The door opened, and there was Anya, calm and unharmed, a bucket of ashes in her hand. The air that wafted out of the dugout was warm and smelled of coffee. The men stood in stunned silence. They had come as saviors. They found themselves utterly irrelevant. Over the next few days, the story spread through the town. It was told first by a humbled and deeply changed Mr. Sterling. He described the warm floor, the fresh air, the impossible efficiency of the small shelter. He did not spare himself, recounting his own ignorance and condescension. He explained the principles of the system as Anya had explained them to him. The townspeople listened, first with disbelief, then with a dawning sense of wonder. They began to visit the dugout, not as a curiosity, but as a place of learning. Anya received them all with the same quiet dignity. She would show them the stove, the vents, and explain the path of the heat under the floor. She answered their questions with simple, factual statements. She held no grudge. She sought no apology. Her vindication was not in their praise, but in the simple fact that her system had worked when all of theirs had failed. The dugout was no longer a burrow. It was a marvel. It was a lesson in humility, a testament to the idea that the most elegant solutions are often the simplest, and that wisdom is not always found in the places society deems important. The woman they had dismissed had built the only truly winter-proof home in the entire territory. The legacy of the Great Blizzard of 1888 was not one of hardship, but of education. The following spring, Mr. Sterling, using his own funds, commissioned the construction of 2 more dugouts on the edge of town, to be used as emergency shelters for travelers or for families who had fallen on hard times. He insisted that Anya supervise the construction. She did, teaching the men the forgotten arts of her husband, showing them how to read the earth, how to shape the clay, how to build the serpentine flue that turned waste into warmth. The structures she had built out of necessity became a model for the community. The design was copied, adapted, and improved upon over the years. The principles of thermal mass and efficient heat exchange, once dismissed as folk nonsense, became the new conventional wisdom. Anya lived in her dugout for another 10 years. She never sought recognition. She never asked for anything. She simply lived her life, her quiet existence a constant reminder of a winter when the earth itself had provided shelter, and a forgotten woman's inherited knowledge had saved the man who tried to cast her out. Her home was more than a shelter, it was an argument, made not with words, but with stone and clay and warmth. An argument that had been won, decisively.